Hello, you're listening to the Her Head in Films podcast. I'm your host. My name is Caitlin. I am a writer. I'm a feminist. I'm 27 years old. I love literature, art, and cinema. I created this podcast as a way to share my personal thoughts and musings on cinema. The title of the podcast, if you're curious or if you're new to the podcast, came from an email that I sent someone a few years ago. And in the email, at the time I was really obsessed with cinema, and I usually am. But at that time I go through periods where it's like almost a fever, you know what I mean? Like I just get obsessed with watching movies. And I said in the email, my head isn't in the clouds, my head is in films. And so I thought that it sort of perfectly captured the way I feel about cinema, which is that that I'm always thinking about it, that it sometimes consumes me watching films. I watch films because they make me feel less alone, because I feel a sense of connection sometimes to the stories. Sometimes I watch films to escape, to escape my reality. And sometimes I watch films to be entertained or to feel some kind of pleasure. And then other times I'll watch films because I want to go more deeply into a topic or into something. So I watch films for many reasons, but I mean, at the end of the day, it really is what helps keep me alive and what helps me live, what helps me see the world in a different way, in a deeper way, to learn the stories of other people. I mean, ultimately, that's what it's about for me, is to learn other people's stories and their experiences in the world. Because when you really stop to think about it, and I think about this a lot, way too much really, is that there is, I mean, how many people are on the earth right now? Like 6 billion, 7 billion? I could be off. I'm not really sure, but it's like, oh my God, all these people on the earth, and every single one of them has their own unique story and their own unique experiences, and yet certain experiences connect us or bind us to other people. And it's just, this world is so vast. It's so many languages, so many cultures, so much diversity. And what I love about watching cinema, and I watch a lot of foreign films, I watch a lot of art house and international cinema, because that's really important to me. It's important that, for me, cinema breaks down borders. It breaks down walls, especially at a time when we're trying to build up those walls and to build up borders between one another. And so it's you can't learn all 6 billion or 7 billion of those stories. You can't really completely understand another culture that's different from your own, but you can try. You can give it your best shot to try to understand people who are different from you and lead different lives, and that is something that I try to do in my life. And I wish more people wanted to do that, but and I just wanted to go on a little bit of a tangent. I've been thinking a lot about this podcast, and I also started a book podcast where I talk about literature that I read, and I'll put that in the description of the episode. But I was thinking about how this podcast, I started it on a lark. I just sort of started it as just something that I thought would be interesting, or like, I go through periods when it's difficult for me to write. Writing is very important to me, and I do consider myself a writer. But sometimes it's just easier for me to talk or for me to speak or whatever, and I don't always want to write about a book or a film. And I live in a rural area in the South in the United States, and I don't have people to talk to about books and films. I mean, these are the main passions of my life, but I don't really have anybody to share my thoughts or opinions with. And so that's what this podcast functions as. It's this outlet for me to talk about, film. And I was just thinking about how powerful that's been for me to start this podcast, because I've always been a very shy, very socially anxious person. I really struggle with anxiety in my life. I struggle with depression as well. And these are things that have been a major part of my life since I was a child. And I was thinking about how much of my life I feel very silenced, and I feel very marginalized. When I was a child, when I was in school, when I was in elementary school and stuff, I was so shy. I was so socially awkward and anxious that the other kids would sometimes ask me if I was mute because I couldn't speak. And I was so scared to speak. And I was scared of people. And I guess in some way I still am. I was unable to connect to people and to talk to people. And, recently I graduated college a few years ago, in 2014. And I have a Bachelor of Arts in English and in Women's and Gender Studies. I double majored in college. And I loved my classes. I loved most of them and really enjoyed them. But a huge part of some of these classes was having to speak, was having to engage in discussions and seminars. And for the life of me, I could not do it. And I really struggled to do it. There were maybe a few classes that were maybe smaller, and I was able to talk in them. But it was I could never really, in the moment when you raise your hand or, sorry, when you get called on, it was my mind would go completely blank, and I couldn't think of what to say, and I couldn't think of anything interesting or deep or intellectual or meaningful to say. And then of course I would be in a classroom with these really brilliant feminist thinkers, or people who were able to articulate themselves so well in class and in front of a group, and I never felt like I could really do that. Maybe I would think of something later, after class had ended, and it caused a lot of doubt and insecurity for me that I wasn't able to express myself and articulate myself in front of people, because I would get so nervous and my heart would race, and I would lose it. I would just feel so paralyzed and debilitated, in that moment, and I couldn't give what was expected of me, and what was demanded. And so it's this thing that's haunted me my whole life, this silence, this inability to speak, this inability to be heard or to have a voice or to be heard, And so I think that's why having this podcast has been so important to me, and such a positive thing. I love doing these podcasts. It's actually, I find it really cathartic. I find it really therapeutic, because I talk about films, and in my book podcast I talk about literature as well. I talk about these things in a very personal way, because that's just how I live. I've been through a lot in my life. I've been through a lot of loss. I've been through a lot of grief. I've been through poverty. I've been through, any number of difficult and traumatic events. So sometimes, I wake up and I'm just trying to survive the day. I don't have a whole lot left, and I don't have a whole lot to give sometimes. So when I think about art and literature and films, these are not theories to me. This is not an intellectual exercise. This is not, something dry or academic for me. This is like, I don't want to say life and death, but it's important. It's salvation to me. When I watch a film and it speaks to me and it speaks to my heart, like, that matters to me. That helps get me through the day. That helps me, find meaning and sustenance in life. Like, some of you know, some of you don't know. If you're new, I lost my father when I was 16. In 2006, my father died, and it was shattering, and it was catastrophic for me, and it completely wounded me, and it's something that I still am completely, broken by, because he was not just my father, he was my best friend, and he was my supporter and my champion. And I didn't have a lot of people in my life who loved me and who cared about me, and I still don't. And I really don't have any family. I don't have many friends, so I have my mom. That's who I mainly have now. She's my main support. But my father was a very crucial, central, important person to me, and he was a beautiful person, and he was everything, and losing him was incomprehensible. Losing him was my worst fear realized, and I've never come back from it. I've never really recovered from it, but I have found a way to keep living, and I keep living because of art and because of these films, because of these books. You know what I mean? Like, that's why I keep living. Like, besides, my mother and the love I have for her, obviously she's kept me alive, but there is this other part of me, that just craves knowledge and craves books and needs books, needs films. I need these things to nourish me and to keep me alive and to keep me awake and alert and to remind me of what I'm doing here and to remind me that there's still beauty in life, that there is still a point to any of this, because I think when you lose somebody you love, it's just everything becomes so pointless, so meaningless. What is this life without that person? That's really another discussion, but I did want to just talk about how this podcast has really helped me. And it's something that has become really important to me, and it has become an outlet for me to share my thoughts and my feelings, and to feel like other people are hearing me, to feel like I have a voice, and that I'm connecting with people in some way. And I've gotten some positive feedback about the podcast, and people who really enjoy it and who like it, and that means the world to me, to think that, my voice is reaching somebody, somewhere, because life is so lonely, it's so difficult and lonely, and, I think if you can hear a voice and you can connect with someone who maybe articulates things that you feel yourself or that you think, I think that's a really powerful experience to have. So I just wanted to say that before I start talking about this film. So the film that I'm going to talk about is not well known. It's probably a film that you haven't seen, but it's a film that I felt like I needed to talk about. And so it's called Arábia. It's from this year, 2017. It's a Brazilian film, It's a small film actually by two men who directed it, and I don't even know where to start. But it's set in Brazil. It is it's I guess you could say it's a kind of a road movie or something, but it's this very profound film about a Brazilian laborer, a Brazilian worker, and that man's name is Cristiano. And the way the film is structured is very interesting because when the film begins, Cristiano has actually been hurt. He works at a factory and he is lying in the hospital, and we don't actually know what's wrong with him or what happened, but something has happened and he is unconscious and he's in the hospital. And of like a friend of Cristiano's, there's this woman that he's friends with. She has a nephew, I think it's her nephew that she's taken in, and he goes to Cristiano's apartment or house, and he finds this notebook that Cristiano has written in. And the notebook basically tells Cristiano's life. He wrote his story after joining a theater group at the factory where he works in Brazil. And what his story is about is the common person, the ordinary person. And he is a laborer. He's also someone who has traveled across Brazil and done various jobs, various difficult jobs. He's worked on a farm, he's worked in factories, he's unloaded trucks, he's done all kinds of like very physical, laborious jobs that are arduous and difficult. And so there's a political aspect to this film that's not necessarily explicit, but it is a film that's about work, that's about the exploitation of workers in Brazil. It's about one man's story as a laborer. And he meets different people as he travels around Brazil doing odd jobs. And it's a simple story in many ways, It's about Cristiano's life. But it's very poetic because the film is told through his words, and it's told in his voiceover. So you hear the actor speaking the words that are in the notebook that he's written. And so, often when it comes to poor people or the working class or the marginalized, we can often be given things that speak for them, that maybe a privileged person is trying to speak for the oppressed. And what I loved about this film was that it was really about a person of an oppressed and marginalized group speaking for themselves and telling their own story. And it's not a documentary, it's a feature film, it's a fictional film. But the directors did a great deal of research about, the working class and laborers. And they also talked to the actor who played Cristiano, and sometimes he would tell stories. And Cristiano is someone who you don't often hear this kind of story about just a common everyday person. And it's about his journey across Brazil. And there's a love story. He falls in love with a woman named Anna, I believe. And she later on in the film sends him this beautiful love letter. And the centrality of writing in the film is really important. Cristiano is telling his story himself. He's writing it in this notebook as an assignment, I guess, when he joined the theater group at the factory. And I guess as someone, I keep a journal, and it's always been really important to me to write about my life and to write about myself and to tell my story and to tell my own narrative. And I think that there is a certain amount of self-discovery and awakening that can happen through writing. And this film really shows the power of, a person writing down their own story and talking about their life. And that's what Cristiano does. And he's the common man. He's sort of the everyday person who does the jobs that a lot of people don't want to do. And it's definitely, I think, a bit of a critique or a commentary on capitalism. I'm not going to pretend to know a lot about Brazil or to know about the social, economic issues of Brazil, but I would imagine that there is inequality. I did watch some documentaries when the Olympics were going on in Rio de Janeiro recently, last year I think it was, and there was a few documentaries that I was watching about, how all this money went into creating these facilities in Rio, and just, a few miles away, there were people living, in poverty and living in really terrible conditions with raw sewage, and people had actually been evicted from their homes to take the land on which these facilities were built. And so I'm actually against the Olympics for that reason. Kind of the Real Sports on HBO with Bryant Gumbel talked about this. They also talked about the Olympics in Russia in Sochi a few years ago. People actually died building those facilities. So there is a lot of human cost to these Olympics. And there's a lot of invisible labor that goes into building the facilities and building the infrastructure. And often that labor is done by the poor and by the marginalized. And so with that in mind, I did watch the film, and it's, even though it's set in Brazil, I think you could find something in it to relate to, just in terms of capitalism and how workers get treated. At one point, Cristiano is working, I don't know if it's an orange grove or tangerines, or it's some kind of fruit grove where he picks fruit from trees. And he's talking to a man who's, I don't know if it was his father or somebody he knew, who was a labor activist and who was trying to get the workers to strike and to demand better wages and better conditions, working conditions, and it was actually helpful, and it actually changed things for some of the workers, although it's still not what it should be. And eventually Cristiano has to leave that job because the person doesn't want to pay him, and he's just not able to continue doing the job because it's just so difficult on his body. And there's this really interesting scene of Cristiano talking to an older man who you can tell is also a laborer and somebody who's worked the fields and stuff. And they're talking about all the different things that they've carried, and how certain things are light. I don't know how to describe it, but they've unloaded trucks, they've carried fruit, they've carried bags of rice, bags of sugar and things like that. And so they're talking about, oh, well, the bag of sugar is heavy, or oh, the bag of rice is so light, I much prefer, carrying the bag of rice. and it's really about, I don't know how to describe it. It's this really interesting scene where they're just thinking back over those experiences of all the things that they've carried and what was the heaviest and what was the lightest. And it makes me think about my father, because my father was a laborer. He worked for much of his life, he worked in furniture factories, where he would unload trucks. Like, he would use like a hand truck or a forklift sometimes, I think, but sometimes he would physically unload trucks. And it was, it could be backbreaking work, and it could be really difficult work. And he did that to provide a life for me, and he was someone who made a lot of sacrifices for me and for my mom, and I always wished better for him. It's hard. It's like there was so much to him, and he loved music. Music was like his big passion. He was always listening to music, and he had sort of this encyclopedic knowledge of music and stuff. And it's like all he did was unload trucks all his life. Like, he never, like, he had dreams. I'm sure he had dreams when he was a teenager, and things he wanted to be and things he wanted to do. And he ended up, at a factory unloading trucks, and you think about that, and you think about people like Cristiano, who, they do want more from life, and they are not able to have it, and it's not for any fault of theirs. It's I don't believe in like this pull yourself up by the bootstraps crap. We live in a society, we live in a world, where people are exploited, and where people struggle to make a living wage and struggle to provide for themselves and their families. And we live in a world where the rights of workers are constantly undermined and are constantly attacked and threatened. And Cristiano is trying to survive. He's doing these jobs not necessarily because he loves them or he enjoys them, but because he has no other option, and he needs to do these things. And his story is one that often is not told in the mainstream media or in films or television shows, which is the life of the working class, the life of a laborer, of a worker. So many movies and TV shows these days just want to focus on rich people or middle class people, and we don't really hear about people like Cristiano who do really difficult jobs and do this they're sort of rendered invisible in many ways. I think about the correlation with the U.S. would probably be Mexican workers, Mexican migrants, and immigrants who have come to the U.S. and often do really back-breaking labor, like, picking fruit off of trees, or, just different forms of labor that really goes unseen and unappreciated in many ways. And so when I was seeing Cristiano's story, I was thinking that would be a really good story that we could tell in the United States about, Mexican or Hispanic immigrants who come to the U.S. and do certain kinds of labor and certain kinds of jobs that we'd rather not talk about, and would rather not acknowledge that work that they do. And what else about this film? It just felt to me like it was this really Cristiano was giving voice to sort of the economically marginalized and the working class, and the oppressed and the exploited, under capitalism. And the ending is just so wonderful. He talks about sort of he's doing this really backbreaking job at a factory, and he stops and he looks around him, and he sort of just sees the pointlessness of it. He's like, why are we doing this? Why are we running our bodies into the ground to do this job, and we have no lives and we have nothing, and he sort of fantasizes about, stopping and leaving the factory, and the other workers coming with him, and leaving the factory, and escaping. It's sort of a daydream about escaping this backbreaking work and this backbreaking labor that he's had to do for much of his life. Even though he's pretty young, he's somebody who's in his 20s, I guess, maybe his early 30s, and he's coming to the realization that for all these years, he's traveled across the country, and he's met some great friends, and that's a great part of the movie too, is all the different people he meets and the other workers that he meets who relate to his struggle and his story. But at some point he realizes, I've done all this work, I've done all these jobs, I've struggled and struggled to make ends meet, to put food in my mouth, to just have some kind of life, some kind of existence. And what do I really have? What have I really accomplished with all of this? And he sees the injustice of it. He sees the sort of the emptiness of it, And I think movies like this, movies about the working class, or movies about people who do backbreaking labor, I think they force us to think about our complicity, our responsibility in it, and what will we tolerate when it comes to the toll that it takes on people's bodies to do certain kinds of work for us. When I think of this, I think of, for example, Amazon. Amazon.com. The warehouses. When you order something from Amazon, I don't know if a lot of people realize it, but when you order these things, there are warehouses throughout the United States, and I guess they're in other countries too. I'm not sure. And there is a person who is responsible for getting that item and shipping it. And they often have to run around these warehouses. They are monitored basically every minute of the day. I guess they're wearing something that they have on is monitoring them. And they have this scanner, and they scan things. And sometimes in a given day, they will walk or run miles. It adds up all the steps that they take. It equals like miles and miles that they end up having to run. And it's difficult. It's physically grueling and exhausting. I read this story a few years ago about a man who died. He had like a heart attack or something. And there was a story a few years ago too where that was about how one of the Amazon factory or warehouses got so hot that people were like passing out, and they would have like ambulances outside these warehouses. Or I think of something like UPS. I remember in college we read this essay about somebody who worked at UPS, and they were shipping things, and it was backbreaking work. It was long hours for low pay. It was very demanding on a person's body. Or even think of what my father did, with loading and unloading trucks, and how difficult that work could be. And so I think we need to think about work and the different types of work that people do and the toll that it takes on their bodies, and how we live in a society where we tolerate that, where we say, well, I want that Amazon, and I'm part of this too. I order from Amazon too. Like, I'm not saying I'm above this or anything, but when I make that order, somebody's running around a warehouse to find that item and to ship it, and that's taking a toll on their body. That's just the truth. And I worked in customer service a few years ago for a place, and it was a clothing company, and the warehouse employees never got a day off. They had to work overtime. Sometimes there would be injuries on the job, and it sounded pretty grueling and pretty difficult in the warehouse section where they shipped the clothes and stuff. And so a lot of people who ordered those clothes, and it was a very popular clothing brand, they may not realize that in order for them to get those clothes, somebody's having to do really difficult labor to bring that to them. And, as capitalism gets worse and worse and worse, because, workers don't have a lot of rights and they don't have a lot of bargaining power, and unions have been demolished. And there seemed to be a similar correlation in Brazil with Cristiano, doing a lot of these menial jobs with very little pay, very little protections, very little, and we see with the Trump administration, they're already, probably thinking about, they're already attacking the Environmental Protection Agency. They're trying to, really set us back in terms of our environment and workers, work conditions and things like that. So it's like, what are we willing to tolerate? When it comes to the types of jobs that people do and the toll it takes on their bodies, and how sometimes it kills them. You know what I mean? It actually kills people to do some of these jobs. We've all heard horror stories, about different warehouses or different factories or, different places like that. I myself worked in a factory when I graduated high school. My father died when I was 16, and it basically plunged me and my mother into poverty. And we really struggled to make ends meet. And I didn't go to college right out of high school. I actually I went and worked at a factory to make money, and it was terrible. Like, I hated it. There were no windows. I made minimum wage, so I made about $7.25. And it was a terrible job, and it took a huge toll on my health, and my health has never been the same. So, I think a lot about these things. I think about work. I think about, the jobs that people have to do in this world and in this country, and how often those jobs can have mental consequences and physical consequences on people's bodies and on their lives. Or we see more and more how, a lot of jobs are like in the service sector, and a lot of those jobs are performed by women and by women of color. And then you think of like the home health aides, which are becoming much more numerous because the population of the United States is getting older and older because of the baby boomers. So the demand for home health aides has risen and increased. And they're paid like nothing. I mean, minimum wage, and they do back-breaking work to take care of people. And a lot of those jobs are performed by women of color, and I'm sure that takes a huge toll on their bodies, to have to do really physical and back-breaking work. And they have few protections and few benefits, And so I just think more and more about, like, we as a society, we as a people, we as humans, you know, the work that we tolerate and the types of jobs that we demand that people do. It's there's to me there's a morality there. Is how can how could we make work more ethical? How could we make work more like tolerable and sustainable, for people's lives and people's bodies? And I guess I'm sort of living in a dream world to think we would ever get to a place like that, but as someone who has seen what certain types of work can do to people and how difficult they can be and the toll that it takes and the consequences of that kind of work, it does make me think, and with Cristiano you have a character who really embodies that, who has really put his body on the line, to perform these jobs. And now he's laying in a hospital unconscious. We don't really know what happens to him, but we feel very connected to him because we've heard his story and we've seen what his life was like, and the writing that is attributed to Cristiano in the film. It's simple, but it's so poetic. to stop thinking about it. Like, I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and it's just a really brilliant film, and I definitely hope that you will have the chance to see it, you know. It's one of those films I wish, like, Netflix would get or something, and, because I would just love for more people to see this film and to get to experience it for themselves. We need more films like this that tell these stories, the stories of people who are really rendered invisible and rendered sort of voiceless and who are silenced. But of course with Cristiano, he's resisting that. You know, he's resisting that silencing, and he's telling his own story, and really shows the power of writing, you know, in being able to create your own narrative and to tell your own story in your own words. And you know how important and essential that is, really. So, but that's Arabia, and the title, if you're wondering, it just comes from a joke that is told in the film. I'm not totally sure why they chose it as the title, but it's just from a joke that one of the characters makes. So that's all that I have to say about this film, but it's one of those that stays with you and that you'll remember and that you'll be grateful for having seen. So if you get the chance to see it, or if you see it online or something, I definitely think that it's worth watching and that it's a very special film. Anyways, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Bye.